the very beginning, when he was a kid and I was a kid.
BC.
Pleasure to have you again.
Get me.
So avail us of your wisdom. You have.
Take it away.
We can't see you, that's right in front of your face.
It's as low as it can go.
Oh, it'll go lower.
Oh, yeah.
Give him a
Yeah,
higher
and okay. Can you see his face?
But it was,
Can you see the bottom of the beard? That's really important.
But now we can't see her face.
Sorry.
For the taller chair?
Do you want to see it on the higher chair?
that's too tall for me. That's fine.
Can you see the bottom of his beard yet?
Yes, sir.
This is the new
Really important.
surveyor's mark.
Now you can't see his nose.
So I will start that with you. Welcome to my Victorian Inklings show and tell. I begin with a borrowed Mary Poppins carpet bag. She graciously didn't know I took it. Mr. President, First Lady, members of Congress, and honored guests. Yes, nice to be here. Mike has assured me of at least 6 hours of presentation time. And is Robin here? There. I would like to begin with a frog walked into a bar. Is that how that went?
Bang.
Bang, bang. We already did that one. Okay. We'll move on. It's a divine appointment for all of us to be here, you know that.
Amen.
It is. For the bunch of us to be together is that very thing. My better half said that pretend that you're in a room full of besties. And I think I am.
Amen.
How did Bilbo say it? I know half of you half as well as I'd like to know you. And the other half of you I don't know at all. Before I begin, you guys are righteous dudes. Welcome to what I've worked on for a while now, and I've gotten thoroughly captivated by it. Alice meets Irene, the unexpected friendship of Charles Dodson, Lewis Carroll, and grandfather, George MacDonald. For the sake of simplicity, let's go with Charles and George. All of us, to receive what we have this weekend in this lesson, this presentation, we all have different grids and filters and lenses and compasses that we gauge what we learn by and who we are by. By the way, is there anyone here who is associated with William Jessup University this time around? No? Okay. We had a couple last year. This experience of research has been both revolutionary and revelational. It's changed me. What I have been given is not what I started out with. I'm very excited to be sharing this with all of you. In the spirit of full disclosure, when Mike first asked if I would speak, I said, sure. And this time I thought I would like it to be something that I would choose myself. And I twisted his arm and he gave in. And in choosing this topic, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And in the spirit of full disclosure, bear with me, I have about 18,000 quotes, and there may be some repetition. I tried to do the best that I could, but it's always good to rehear it again. I think what I'll do to start off with is, I know it's taken away some from my allotted time, but I think it's necessary. I have two very brief bios of the two gentlemen. Here's George first. 1824, 1905. Scottish novelist, clergyman, and author of children's stories, was admired by many of his peers for his tender spirituality through his graceful poems and fantastical verse. They rank high among the classics of juvenile literature. In his George MacDonald anthology, C.S. Lewis states that while reading a copy of his Fantasies a few hours later, through the inspiration of the gentle Christian's words, I knew that I had crossed a great frontier. I know of hardly any other writer who seems closer or more continuously close to the Spirit of Christ himself. Auden and J.R. Tolkien also admired his efforts. Fantasies was to become his definitive work of his career. Through his writing, peppered with the Doric dialect, he asserted that there was a God and an art, and the expression of creativity of spirit brought one closer to him. Other successful titles were Back of the North Wind, The Princess and the Goblin, The Princess and Curdie. He was born in Huntly, western part of Aberdeenshire, Scotland, on 10 December 1824, the son of George MacDonald Sr., farmer, and Helen Mackay. He was educated in country schools where Gaelic myths and Old Testament stories abounded. He then went on to Aberdeen University in the early 1840s, obtaining awards in moral philosophy and sciences. He would later be awarded an honorary doctorate from his esteemed institution. Next, he studied for the Congregationalist Ministry of Highbury College, London. In 1850, he was made pastor at Arundel, West Sussex, England. MacDonald resigned, however, after 3 years of not living up to the congregational authorities' expectations for more dogmatic sermons and being accused of heresy. Rejecting his Calvinistic upbringing and doctrine of predestination, he came to believe in a divine presence but not divine providence, and felt that everyone was capable of redemption. George MacDonald married Louisa Powell in 1851. They had 6 sons and 5 daughters together. One of their sons, Greville MacDonald, would later become a writer himself and an author biography of his father and mother. After staying in Algiers to regain his health, MacDonald returned to England to tutor and write to provide for ever-growing family needs and present freelance writings whenever time permitted. Despite his successful career as a published writer, he was consistently forced to rely on the charity of others and friends. Lady Byron was one such patron who assisted him until her death in 1860. Some of the early poetry was Within, Without, etc., etc. Alec Forbes, David Elginbrod, Robert Falconer were early novelists. The 1870s brought an invitation for MacDonald to tour and lecture in America. He was well received by huge audiences and writers such as Emerson. A well-paid ministerial position was offered to him in New York, but he chose to return to England. 1877, he was pensioned at the request of Queen Victoria. The ill health that had plagued him the greater part of his life forced him to seek the warmer climates and ended the warmer climates of Europe. One of his daughters was taken to Italy for a cure in 1877, though she ended up perishing. That was Mary Josephine. However, MacDonald found, beg your pardon, heaven of the English is his house, Casa Correggio. His wife was the organist of the Catholic Church there and often held concerts and amateur plays in their home, socializing and having a merry time. Titles published around this time were Sir Gibby, Donald Grant, and Lilith in 1895. Louisa Powell died 1 year later, and George after their golden wedding anniversary in 1902. George, after a long illness, died in Surrey, England on September 18, 1905. His remains were cremated and they were taken to his beloved Bordighera for interment alongside his wife. A memorial to George has been erected in the Drumblade churchyard. And for Charles, it's a little shorter. Charles Dodson, 1832-1898, better known by his pen name as Lewis Carroll, was an English writer, mathematician, logician, Anglican deacon, and photographer. His most famous writings are Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, The Looking Glass, Hunting of the Snark, Jabberwocky. He is noted for his facility at wordplay, logic, and fantasy. As a very young child, he suffered a fever that left him deaf in one ear. At age 17, he suffered a severe attack of whooping cough, which was probably responsible for his chronically weak chest in later life, much like George. Within the academic discipline of mathematics, he worked primarily in the fields of geometry, matrix algebra, mathematical logic, and recreational mathematics, producing a dozen books. Yeah. Notice that I didn't say top four. He also developed new ideas in the study of elections, the Dodson method, and committees. He worked as a mathematician tutor at Oxford, an occupation that gave him some financial security. He died in 1898 of pneumonia, following influenza just 2 weeks into his 66th birthday. Okay, that's the logistics of who they were and are. So, prepare yourself now to be taken back to a magical time and place, Victorian London. An adventure of intrigue, sprinkled with a pinch of mystery and majesty. And now please securely fasten your metaphysical safety belts. You know how they have, before Oscar time, Hollywood will run posters that say for your consideration, Gladiator or whatever the movie is. Well, I have divided my presentation into 5 screenplay scenes for your consideration. I will be sharing the story, and in the process of this, we will be experiencing time travel. And I was going to say Jason Brents, but he's not here. For what it's worth, I have a semester's worth of stuff here, and I'll share as well as I can. So as Rush Limbaugh would say, listen quickly. My editor advised me to edit. So there's a lot to cover, so let's roll. And Mr. Editor, thanks again for this chance to share and explore. And as Paul Harvey would say, soon you will know the rest of the stories. We are going to become Victorian time travelers now. Both authors believed in it and wrote about it. Personally, in this literary adventure, I have found a holiness sprinkled throughout both men's writings and lives. They were God lovers and God chasers. I have divided my time travel into 5 scenes. The first scene, though conjecture on my part could easily have happened, probably did historically. Their friendship and the historic record therein certainly suggests it. I would therefore suggest that scene 1 is the original Inklings meeting. 1940s, Jack Lewis, Tolkien, etc. would gather together in the Bird and the Baby, the Eagle and the Child pub somewhere in England, and they would share warm beer and pipes. And they would discuss their stuff that wasn't written yet, their manuscripts of Narnia and Lord of the Rings. Can you imagine being there, hearing this stuff float in the air, and just the holiness and the awe involved? And there were many other men there as well, no women.
Except Dorothy Sayers.
Pardon?
Dorothy Sayers.
Occasionally. Gold star. So, I invite you to engage with me as I welcome you into the magical and imaginary worlds of these 2 saints, mystics, and friends. Come away with me and accept this invitation to get mystical and magical. It's now time to shake timidity and discover. I now present for your edification and enjoyment, Alice meets Irene. So what I would like you to do, based on a power and a force that's not of your own choosing, everyone close their eyes, except for the person walking. If you can, close your eyes and let's go on an adventure. Picture in your mind's eye, it's an early summer Victorian London afternoon in 1870. Imagine, if you dare, you are a 19th century time traveler. I will join you. We're up in a bank of clouds and fog, and it feels comfortable. And all of a sudden we feel ourselves going down, 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 down. We break through the clouds, the bank of fog, and we're high above 18th century summer, early summer London. As we come closer and closer to the city, it's bustling, it's moving, it's quick. There's so much happening, there's activity and energy everywhere. There are men and women walking back and forth along the roads. The businesses are booming, the carriages and the horses, they're clacking. You're dropped onto the street in a super busy thoroughfare, and you realize you are immediately standing behind two gentlemen dressed in their finery, one about 6'3", the other about 5'11". They are walking in front of you briskly, a great gait, and you have to almost run to keep up with them. They don't know that you're behind them. They are walking, they are chatting, they are laughing. Their arms are going back and forth, and under each arm of the other arm of these two men, they are carrying leather portfolios. You notice that, but you have to keep up with them. You're going quickly. They are walking toward a tavern, a pub, and as they go through the double wooden doors, you are behind them about a couple of feet. They still don't see you. They go immediately for the bar, and they see the bartender, and he greets them wildly with great enthusiasm and excitement. They sit down. They place their leather portfolios on top of the bar. You're still behind them. They still don't see you. But they're laughing, speaking quickly, wildly, and enjoying each other's company immensely. And they are in the midst, as they pull out manuscripts from these leather portfolios, and they lay them in front of each other. The taller man has a manuscript that reads Through the Looking Glass. The smaller man has a manuscript that reads The Princess and the Goblin. Once you read those, you realize, oh my gosh, this is a moment of wonder. You're experiencing a history that very few people know, and you're part of it, and you're behind them. And as they are served their beverage, they notice that you're behind them, and they look around, and they both grin at you. They are thrilled to see you, and as they take their hands out to shake your hand, the scene leaves, it pops. You can open your eyes now. That must have been fun to have been there with them as they read out loud Through the Looking Glass to George, and George read Princess and the Goblin to Charles, to get their feel. Yes, that's wonderful. No, don't keep that. The interchange that must have been just magic and wonderful and amazing and delightful and even suspenseful. I won't have you close your eyes now, but the scene does change as the scene too. 11 years earlier, kind of like the TV show This Is Us, that goes back and forth and back and forth. The screen reads 11 years earlier, 1859, the first meeting. Somewhere between autumn of 58 and early spring of 59, at Dr. James Hunt's speech therapist offices in Hastings, Charles, 26, and George, 34, met for the first time. They were both public speakers, they both had stuttering issues, they both sought relief, and magically and providentially they met there. And the exact details aren't precise because Charles's diary entries for that time frame are missing, but other historical documents show that they did meet there and they were receiving help from this doctor. It must have been glorious to have been there when they first met each other, not realizing what would take place and what would happen. A little bit later, in early 1860, Charles was visiting Alexander Monroe's sculpture studios in London, and there happened to be Greville, 4, and Mary Josephine, 7, George's kids. Greville was being sculptured into something or other, and Charles was introduced to the two of them, and within minutes they became best friends. You know how small children can be. He was introduced to George as well when George came to pick the kids up, and he became known officially then as Uncle Dodson. Scene 3. The screen reads, 3 years later, summer of 1862. Charles is 30, George is 38. Charles meets George at his residence at Tudor Lodge. Let me read this diary entry to you from Charles's diary. July 9, 1862, Charles Dodson wrote in his diary, "To Tudor Lodge, where I met Mr. MacDonald coming out. I walked a mile or so with him on his way to a publisher with the manuscript of his fairy tale, The Light Princess, in which he showed me some exquisite drawings by Arthur Hughes. It is a rather striking coincidence that Dodson, who only a few days earlier had told the story of Alice to the Liddell children, Alice and her two sisters, the deacon that he worked for at the college, and he should happen to call on George MacDonald at his London home in the morning when George was taking to the publisher, Macmillan, a short story that began his career as a children's story writer, The Light Princess. Moreover, Charles Kingsley, meanwhile, was writing The Water Babies. In other words, these three men began to make their contributions to children's literature within weeks of each other. Moreover, all three were ministers of religion, if of very different types, and all three had intensive scientific or mathematical interests. Pardon me. A pattern begins to emerge, particularly when we realize that religious uncertainty, a thread which seems to run through The Water Babies and Alice, played a central role in the life of George MacDonald. I came to determine that it was the Shadows poem that Macmillan published, the little 5-stanza ditty. I won't read it right now, but I have a copy of it here in case any of you would like to see it. It's from the March 1862 edition of Macmillan's Magazine, London. I have several points of interest regarding this, and I'll go through them quickly. Number one, Macmillan published The Shadows, one of George's earliest poems, to be published in 1862. Hence, because of this, the firm became one of his active publishers. Excuse me. Point 2. Macmillan asked George to lengthen Light Princess into a novelette, but George felt that it was conclusive in and of itself, a completed creation. Point 3. George must have written Light Princess as early as 1861, since he read the manuscript to his college students at Bedford College in 1862, the 2 semesters. Point 4. Arthur Hughes, the pre-Raphaelite illustrator who illustrated the story for George, must have executed these drawings as early as 1861. Point 5. Hurst and Blackett, one of George's publishers, eventually published The Light Princess as a part of the novel Adela Cathcart in 1864 as a triple-decker, a 3-volume entity. Point 6. Therefore, George had The Light Princess manuscript and the pictures in his portfolio for at least 3 years. What's interesting also in this trip to Macmillan this day, Charles was looking for an illustrator for Alice. George recommended to him, based on Undine, 1861, John Tenniel. Undine came out in 1845. George owned a copy of 1861 and enjoyed the illustrations. Excuse me. Another point of interest, we'll talk about John Tennille in a moment. Excuse me. They usually don't talk this much. Right here. Another point of interest and utterly fascinating, John Tennille, he was the illustrator, one of them for Punch magazine during many, many, many decades. When he was a youngster, he and his dad were fencing. His dad was teaching him how to fence. One fencing incident, his father forgot to put on that little rubber protective point on the tip, and unbeknownst, the point went into one of John's eyes, and he lost it. His father did not know this, and he kept it from his father his entire life. In the meantime, he became one of the world's great illustrators with one eye. He illustrated Alice and Through the Looking Glass with one eye.
How do you hide that from your dad? Later, I'll question.
Yes. Scene 4. The screen reads 3 months later. And this is the picture that I had revolving for you guys. In early summer of 1862, at Elm Lodge in Hampstead, I call the picture a string in the grass. Charles was an expert photographer. He had a string attached to his pinky, invisible through the grass, up to the camera. He invented the automatic shutter release system. That was one of his first attempts. That's how the picture was made. It took about 45 seconds. By this time, Charles was officially known within the family as Uncle Dodson. He photographed from 1856 to 1880, 24 years. One of the pioneers of Victorian photography, in addition to his mathematics lectureship. He photographed the MacDonalds in 1862 to 1863 and got all of them that were there at the time. He was he was a contemporary and colleague of Julia Margaret Cameron, if anyone is familiar with her. She was from 1815 to 1879. There was a 17-year difference, and even though they criticized each other's work in a playful fashion, they became colleagues and friends, photographed each other. It was during this time frame that George read the Alice manuscript, then had Louisa read the Alice manuscript to the kids. The kids went nuts, and they encouraged and finally talked Charles into publishing it. Here's a quote from his diary, Charles. This is still scene 4, 1862. One day Dodson appeared at Tudor Lodge with a large manuscript under his arm, rendered by hand in impeccable calligraphy, complete with pages of meticulously wrought drawings. It was entitled Alice's Adventures Underground. He asked George to read it and to render an opinion when he had time. After reading it, George suggested that Louisa read it to the kids and gauge their reactions. The children were wildly enthusiastic. Greville, then 6, loudly proclaimed there should be 60,000 copies of it. And Macmillan accepted the manuscript, and in 1865, the result was Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. What's interesting is that during this time frame, Robinson Duckworth was his buddy in the pastorate at Christchurch, Oxford, when they went on these boat trips with the 3 little girls. Charles wanted to call it Alice's Adventures Underground. It was Robinson who talked him into Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and the duck in the story is Duckworth.
Yes.
Excuse me. I have some Orts table scraps. That's one of George's books for Alice Sweet Siren. Ort 1. In Writer's Life, you mentioned something that hits me hard, and I think it's super cool. You felt that you had met and discovered the novel heartbeat of George. In this study, I feel that I have met and been introduced to the friendship heartbeat of the two men. George was a novice boxer. Didn't know that. Wilfred Dodson, Charles' brother, taught Mary how to box. Mary was Charles' favorite of the children, and when she died of tuberculosis in 1878 at 25, George was working on the manuscript of Sir Gibbie at the time, and I want to throw in something here. This is off the record, but me. I'm going to take a step out on a limb here and be bold in my old age. It's my contention and conjecture and belief that George converted or translated his intense personal grief into literary holiness as a cathartic response to the process. I found this countless times. To survive and even thrive as he did as a writer and a saint. And I believe this reaction to grace saturates his writings. As he lost children and other family members along the paths of life, and they lost 4 children,
Wow.
his response to this repetition of crushing sadnesses created mystical and even supernatural stories. He designed this creative output to defeat any darkness and overcome sadness, to maintain inwardly, allowing this process to heal him from within and delight from without. In my discovery of Charles and the like reaction, his response to grief in this life seems quite quieter and softer. He lost loved ones along the way, as we all do, and there was actually minimal literary output when this occurred for him. His introvert nature probably accounts for this opposite therapy and response. Queen Victoria adored Wonderland. She frequently allowed him to visit and occasionally babysit the grandkids.
Wow.
To me, that speaks very strongly. There are some areas of concern and jibber-jabber that he, well, anyway, you guys probably know. To me, for Queen Victoria to trust the man, both Charles and George were prose poets and wrote metaphysically. Charles suffers from a rare neurological disorder condition in which causes strange hallucinations and affects the size of visual objects. This can make the sufferer feel larger or smaller than they really are. A huge theme of both books, don't you think?
Yeah.
The disease, first discovered by English psychiatrist John Todd in 1955, would later become known as the Alice in Wonderland syndrome. In 1890, Charles released The Nursery Alice, a somewhat more simplified version for very young folks of the book. John Tenniel, though in old age, approved of 20 of his illustrations for alteration and colorization. In some cases, he even revised them. Charles was the original righteous dude, even before Ferris Bueller. As he photographed young people during his years as a photographer, and this spoke very strongly to me, he was always chaperoned and always had parental approval. I have a quote from, of all people, Sam Clemens, better known as Mark Twain. From his diary, we met a great many other interesting people that night, among them Lewis Carroll, author of the immortal Alice. But he was only interesting to look at.
Nice words, man.
he was the stillest and shyest full-grown man I have ever met. With the possible exception of Uncle Remus, who was Joel. Chandler... Harris. Oh, please.
You asked.
I did. Thank you. All right. Dr. MacDonald and several other lively talkers were present, and the talk went briskly for a couple of hours, but Carol sat still, while all the while, except now and then, he answered a question. His answers were brief, and I do not remember that he elaborated on any of them. And then this is some commentary. It's clear from Twain's autobiography that he enjoyed the conversation of George MacDonald, whom he always referred to as Dr. MacDonald, so very much indeed. This is a little off my beaten path, but nonetheless, it's really cool stuff. What they may have talked about in private is largely unknown. I do know that for a while they wanted to collaborate on a book and co-author it for international copyright, but it never occurred. We do know that MacDonald wrote many tales that involved dream worlds, and that he took dreams and visions very seriously. Twain undoubtedly read many of these pieces, and he too looked upon the dream world with much earnestness. He took them as a slice of the real world somewhere.
He liked your hat.
Mark Twain, Sam, took them as a slice of real life of this world somewhere, someplace where time runs in a different way from our time, and where the people and things one encounters are absolutely real and beyond our control, rather than produce our own imaginations. He said in his short story, which was The Dream, while you are in a dream, it isn't a dream, it is reality. And the bear bite hurts in a perfectly real way. He also wrote several stories that were based in dream worlds. Mark Twain would also agree with MacDonald that there are few real coincidences that happen in life, if any, for the Christian, as MacDonald might add. Scene 5, and this screen will come to a close. Fast forward 20 years later. Charles is 50, George 58. The last reference that we have to their officially being together, the last reference that we have are for September 22, 1882, when he took the two girls to see the MacDonalds perform in Brighton. Afterwards, he had a short interview with Mr. and Mrs. MacDonald. Carol's friendship with the MacDonalds thus extended for more than 24 years and was at its most intimate during the crucial period immediately before and following and during the writing of the Alice books. Their friendship went from 1858 to 1882, 24 years. And as the final scene fades, George had moved permanently to Italy by 1880, the MacDonalds. Charles had retired from photography by 1880, and as a math lecturer by 1881. And with their deaths, Charles in 1898 at 65, and George in 1905 at 81. Let me zip over very quickly to some of the show and tell that I have. Two? Okay. I'll make it quick. I do want to share.
You do not want to miss any of your show and
for what it's worth, and this is, by the way, this is the book that began it for me in 1976.
Hold it still.
This is the London paperback Princess and the Goblin, the Puffin edition. This is what I was given by a camp counselor in 1976.
76.
That's the little stinker started the whole thing. This is a discovery that I made. This is the first ever treatment of the friendship between the two. 1947, I could only find one copy online, and it was under 10,000. Herbert Nicholson, have known nothing about him but A Voyage to Wonderland and other essays. This began the Lewis Carroll George MacDonald Scholarship 100 years, 80 years ago. I have 3 books that I have borrowed from frequently. This one is called Behind the Back of the North Wind by Winged Lion Press, John Pennington and Roderick McGillis. This one is Informing the Inklings, Winged Lion Press, Mike Partridge and Kirsten Johnson. These things, I mean, they take your breath away, every sentence. A copy of the Journal North Wind from the MacDonald Society. This one is from 2018. And this is the Bible of what I've been working with by John Docherty from London, England. It's called The Literary Products of the Lewis Carroll George MacDonald Friendship. I've had this thing for like 20 years, and 6 months ago I pulled it out to read it. As you know how those things can go. This is the Bible of their relationship. And it's spectacular and weepy and joyful and it's just everything a book of 2 people of this magnitude could be. I want to finish at least with this for you. Because almost. This is by a friend of ours from London. His name is Ian Blakemore. As a literary group, the Inklings met for a very long time and have fascinated and intrigued many of the literary world. Was it a meeting of minds or just a group of intellectuals having a barren bout of male conversation? Some people renamed the Oxford meeting the Drinklings, as they met regularly over a pint of beer at the Bird and Baby. C.S. Lewis remained the center of the circle. They met for a great many years. Around 1933, the Inklings formed, meeting in many nights in Lewis's rooms at Magdalen College shortly after Charles Williams arrived in Oxford at the outbreak of World War II. It is amazing to think that The Lord of the Rings, which Tolkien began in 1937 and read out loud to the Inklings, and as the new Hobbit, they began this, and as well as the Narnia series. One of my favorite quotes is this. It's from Professor Darton in his children's book of Books in England. Writes that MacDonald's quote-unquote contributions to the invented fairy tale was something which was not there before. More than any other prose writer and teller for children at that period, he brought serious imagination into the fabric of his tales. Francisca Colt, professor in London, she wrote recently, Charles had 4,000 volumes in his personal library, most of them scientific in nature. She writes, my doctoral thesis explored the emergence of Victorian psychology and fantastic literature as a sister phenomena through the works of, and I've never read this before ever in any of these sources, author scientists. That's what she calls George and Charles, author scientists. Wow. And includes Charles Kingsley and H.G. Wells. Considering these works, the wider framework of the Victorian history of science, I established fantastic literature as a primary medium for making visible. That's fine. Let me go next to this one, and then I'll read one more for you, and that's for MacDonald. Memory points both backward and forward. There is no past in God Almighty. Therefore, all past experiences are still alive in the eternal realm called the eternal now.
Yeah.
2 minutes and I'll be done. The C.S. Lewis and Owen Barfield during their day had what was called the Great War, as they discussed philosophy, Christian theology. It was described as a prolonged debate between Lewis and Barfield with subtle metaphysical and philosophical distinctions. John Doherty writes in his book in the introduction, George and Charles, however, over a period of 40 years, played a literary game with each other, which is a remarkable confirmation of Blake's dictum that opposition is true friendship. Their game of mythopoeia re-explores the imagination debate of the English Romantic poets. Okay, I'll end with this. There's so much more. Oh, I'll share with you later. The following quotation from Grable shows the extent that the MacDonald's poetic understanding etched itself deep in his children's consciousness. So the immanence of God is the secret of all beauty, and God is knowable to us only through beauty. Human fatherhood invites the imagining of the divine fatherhood. Man's power over the world and its forces imply a personal power, immeasurably mighty in the Creator. Man's love, faithful to the death, makes possible the belief in that Spirit, who so loved the world that through vicarious suffering he saved it. That was from George MacDonald and his wife. He begins to feel that the stars are strange, that the moon is sad, and that the sunrise is mighty. He begins to see in them all the something men call beauty. He will lie in the sunny bank and gaze into the blue heaven till his soul seems to float abroad and mingle with the infinite made visible, and the boundless condensed into color and shape. The rush of the waters of the still twilight, under the faint gleam of the exhausted west, makes in his ears a melody he is almost aware he cannot understand.
When do we get to ask you questions?
There will be no questions. My friend, Dave Hyatt. So, 5 years ahead of me in discovering MacDonald. 70, 76, or 6, what year?
76 was the year that I got the book.
No, you were 5 years ahead of you.
Yeah.
Matt, what's yours?
I was 5 years ahead of you. I thought you were 5 years ahead of me. Nevertheless, I've always been grateful for his first letter to me. See, people who write me letters, it's important. And he wrote a letter, and here we are, 40 years later?
Fisherman's Lady.
People will be someday writing about the inklings of Folsom. All of that, correct? Yes.
By the way, as a side note and a PS to you, I could not, it was there, but I felt I should wrap it up. George, it is historically apparently documented someplace, allowed Charles to read Seekers and Finders.
Wow. Wow. And we will all get to read that someday.
To be continued.
Let everybody else in on that.
Seekers and Finders was MacDonald's first novel. The manuscript of which his sons later read and decided was so bad it was destroyed. The only manuscript. So keep your eye on Robin when I'm gone, because anyway, Seekers and Finders was about 3 manuscript drafts prior to Robert Falconer. It sort of became Robert Falconer, but it was years earlier. It was the first attempt. Remember what I said? Edit, edit, edit. You people that were here yesterday, your writing is rubbish. Even your writing is rubbish, and don't forget it. But MacDonald's first fictional effort was rubbish, and his sons destroyed it. Anyway, we are going